I'm very happy to be here again. And I thought that bringing Lawrence, who was the lead reporter on the investigation, would be very good because, he is the expert in flight tracking and all the nerdy stuff that made this investigation great. So, and he's a great speaker as well. So you will enjoy two of us sharing the floor. So first I'm going to start with this image. And this was an image of a Belarusian cargo plane on the tarmac of the airport in Belgrade. And it was sent to us by a plane spotter who thought this would be something we should, pay attention to. And this investigation, this photo was what led us to uncover $2 billion pipelines of arms from Balkan, Eastern Europe to Syria. So it all started with this image. And I think a year later, we published a project called Making a Killing. And I think a year later, again, we published another project, Making a Killing. So those were two investigations. One was about $1.2 billion arms pipeline from Eastern Europe to Syria, funded by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Jordan. And the other one was the over $2 billion pipeline funded by United States of America. And again, weapons were ending up with Syrian rebels, but also with Islamists. What was unique about this collaboration was that it was collaboration between two organizations, Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, and Lawrence works for BIRN, and Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And unlike normal collaborations where journalists report together but they publish separately, in this case we decided that we are going to publish the same story. And that was a lot of work because we had a different set of editors, we had different set of reporters who all had their idea how the story should be told, different preferences when it came to how many numbers, how many details, but we had one fact-checking. So in the end, we published the story together. It was exactly the same story. We battled a lot over the drafts and how it's going to be told, but at the same time, we also reported the story together and shared the leads and literally shared tasks and met almost monthly for a very long time to discuss where the story is going and how we're going to tell the story. So that was something very unique. Previously, I have worked on, for example, Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, and we share the information, but everybody goes and reports their own stories and publishes their own story. In this case, we were all accountable for what we are going to publish and how we're going to publish. And also, the stories were later published also by Guardian and Süddeutsche Zeitung and probably hundreds of other media. I think at some point we lost the count. We did a story about Saudi Arabia, and suddenly there were hundreds of Arab publications who were republishing our findings. And the investigation was 20 journalists, and again, we shared the journalists too. So we provided some of the journalists and paid for them, and then BIRN provided for some of their own journalists and paid for them. So basically, we paid for all of our reporters in different countries that worked on the story. So I'm not going to talk much about the key findings. I'm going to show two videos. One is about the Saudi-led pipeline. this is the first one, and then I'm going to show you the second investigation about the US funded. So what was so difficult about this investigation? When we first started, the whole arms industry is veiled in secrecy. And even the government is in a way promoting the secrecy and not allowing access to information. So actually it was very difficult to find out even about the exports, and some countries have even declared it a state secret, or they would purposely hide and conceal the information from journalists to report on. So the way we did it, we used open source information, and I think this is why I really like that Lawrence is here with us, because he would get an email alert or a phone alert on his phone in the middle of the dinner with kids and wife, because there was a plane in the air, and he would basically spend a whole dinner just watching where the plane was going, and he did it for many months. I mean, this shows a real determination, because these stories don't come easy. There was not a single place which would give you a lead and a story. He had actually painstakingly had to track every single shipment, and he did it. So it's very, very impressive. And then scraping the data and analyzing the data, the little data that was out there, and basically finding these sources. And then of course developing sources and actually meeting insiders, people from the industry itself. We did use FOIA extensively, and also relied on books and experts to guide us about this industry. And finally, we relied on leaks. So Lawrence, this will
grab the mic.
Yes.
Hi there, I'm Lawrence Marzouk. I'm the investigative editor at Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. So we knew we had a story here, and we had a pretty good indication that there were weapons going from the Balkans, from Central and Eastern Europe to Syria. But I didn't know anything about the arms trade when we set out to do it. And so the initial question obviously is, how do you approach it? How are you going to penetrate this secretive world of arms deals to actually prove that this is happening? And obviously at the end you want to speak to the people in the know. You want to speak to the arms dealers, you want to speak to the government officials. But if you pick up the phone to them initially and say, hey, tell me about these arms deals you're doing in Syria, I hear they might be illegal, you're not really going to get very far. So what we did here, you can apply in terms of a methodology to pretty much any investigation where the aim is to delve into a secretive world. So the idea is you start with, to use a bit of, I suppose, an extended metaphor, you're looking at the ripples on the surface of the water that indicate that something is happening deep down below. You're looking for signs of a story, or potentially you're looking for indications anyway that you're looking in the right place. And that's the open data. It's information that you can access easily, and is going to give you, to really mix my metaphors, a foundation on which to build a story. So you're looking at things like data and statistics to start off with. So although the arms trade is secretive, The deals are all confidential. It's also a really regulated industry, and so there are dozens of different places where you can get statistics. You can get statistics in terms of trade, you've also got social media. So Syria is potentially the first conflict which is being sort of almost told entirely through social media. Syria in particular, there are dozens of videos being uploaded every day from Syria. So you're really able to get a pretty good idea of what's going on the ground by looking at YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. So this isn't you accessing a fighter who is going to give you a first-hand account, but it's giving you key information which is allowing you to build a picture and turning you into an expert. You've got things like official investigations and court cases. US is great for that in particular because all of their documents are public in court cases. So you can get an indication of the type of deals and who's involved by looking through court records. Flight tracking is what Miranda was just mentioning. I became a bit of a plane spotter geek, having never shown any interest in planes up until then. It's quite difficult to hide a plane on a tarmac in any European capital. You can go and stand outside and see it. It's very easy to hide an arms deal, so planes seem like an obvious approach in terms of looking at those ripples on the surface, indications that something was going on. And then obviously media reports were key. We weren't the first to look at this issue, but there were suggestions in other publications that something was going on. So looking at the data in particular, so we were lucky in some respects. What we wanted to prove was that there was a sudden spike in arms exports from Central and Eastern Europe to Saudi Arabia in particular, which was known to be supplying weapons to Syrian rebels at the time. So we were lucky in that the Saudis in particular had no track record of ever buying any Central or Eastern European weapons stock. So the baseline was zero. The trade between the countries was nothing. And then suddenly, in 2012 and 2013, it went from zero to hundreds of millions, and then it was picking up from there. So we used national reports. These are each country in Europe, certainly, and other areas of the world produce yearly arms reports, which will tell you where weapons are being sold. And we inputted those into spreadsheets. The EU produces reports as well. The UN you can look at. You've got Eurostat, which is the European equivalent. We use those more so actually for cargo data. They have they have statistics in terms of the amount of tonnage, the cargo tonnage that's transported between any European airport and anywhere in the world. So we were able to see that from nowhere there were airports like not Belgrade, it's not in the EU, Budapest or Bratislava, and then suddenly they were exporting thousands of tons of unidentified cargo to military air bases in Saudi Arabia. So again, that wasn't proof that there was weapons being sent, but it was an indication that something unusual was happening. Comtrade is the UN database of external trade, import, export, and is an amazing resource for journalists. I recommend that any journalist take a look because it gives you a very quick insight, pretty much in real time, because you get monthly updates from some countries of international trade. So you can see there how the quantity of, say, ammunition being exported from Bulgaria to Saudi Arabia in April 2017. And then the last website or source of data we used in quite some detail was the American procurement website, the US procurement website, which is fpds.gov, which is a real goldmine of data for any journalist because it contains, it's relatively easily searchable, and there are scraped versions online, particularly from a website called enigma.io. And the Americans just published vast quantities of data, including what they're buying in terms of weapons. So all of this data basically gets fed into spreadsheets.
I will just quickly mention here that what was also unique about all these various sources and why we actually needed to get them is because some countries like Croatia, we couldn't get the national reports. But the information about the exports from Croatia and licenses was in EU reports. So we were able to find out the information that the country considered secret through EU and through their declarations to EU.
And actually then Croatia even stopped reporting it to the EU, but they were reporting it to Eurostat and the UN in terms of international trade. So there was another way to get around the fact they were trying to hide where their exports were going. This is one of the tables that we sort of worked on. It was just basically a question of data input. We would go through all the different sources and try and find year by year the quantities of weapons going from these Central and Eastern European countries to the Middle East, and extrapolate from that the trend, which was there was a sudden spike which coincided with the start of the conflict in Syria. And then this is what it looks like in a slightly more intelligible format. So this was the end result, one of the infographics we used to show the flow of weapons. This is an example of FPDS, the US procurement website I was talking about. So for each action that the US procurement agency does, there's a report that's published online like this, which, as you can see, I mean, there's a vast amount of information on there, most of it completely uninteresting. But it was looking at one of these documents which really gave us an idea to do the second investigation, which was into the US purchasing of weapons for Syria. Because what we spotted was that for most of these, you have the country of origin. Country of origin or service. So you can see it says Bulgaria on the left-hand side. And we realized that the US, each time it was buying weapons from the Balkans, it was putting either Serbia or Bulgaria or declaring that the origin, which gave us a good way of filtering out the vast amounts of data, because actually the US isn't really buying anything from Bulgaria apart from weapons. And initially, you can't search on the website using the criteria of country of origin. But we did a bit of scraping ourselves, and we used this website I mentioned, enigma.io, and which has a scraped version of this, and means you can search under any of these criterion. So it's really, really helpful. And when we started digging a bit more into it, and we discovered that in some cases they actually declared where the weapons and ammunition was going. So it says here for Syria and Iraq. Now, the US had never admitted that any of these weapons were going to Syria. They hadn't even told the countries that it was going to Syria. And in fact, the official documents said that the ammunition was going to the US. So this was basically the only document where they admitted the final destination. And they'd basically done it by mistake. They hadn't planned to do it. So then we sent them a message saying, hey, this is interesting. Tell us more about this ammunition going to Syria. And then a few weeks later, we went back on and noticed that they'd gone on and amended and removed all the references to Syria, obviously assuming that we hadn't taken a record of it. So it just made them look a bit silly in the end, because obviously there was an original record. But this was crucial because they were quite canny in terms of putting a bit of plausible deniability in there in terms of where these weapons are going. And this proved beyond reasonable doubt that they were definitely going to Syria. We number crunched all the data. It was about 100 megabytes of data in a spreadsheet, filtered it all down, and produced this in terms of the where weapons were being bought. so all the way from Georgia to Bulgaria, yeah, that was the end result. And so we were basically able to show that all of these countries were unwittingly, they probably knew unofficially, but unwittingly providing weapons for conflicts in the Middle East via the US. Social media. So another one of those sort of, like I said, ripples on the surface was the social media accounts of the many combatants in Syria. So each group in Syria had its own Facebook profile, own Twitter account, Instagram, Telegram. Instagram less popular, but but certainly the others. YouTube, which was essential. So what we wanted to set out to do was demonstrate that that these weapons that were being exported to Saudi Arabia were ending up in Syria. We had the theory was there, the hypothesis was that they were ending up there, but we actually needed to find some weapons on the ground in Syria. And we set about doing that by trawling through vast amounts of videos, mostly, on YouTube, so Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And we were pointed in the right direction. Sometimes there were an army of people on Twitter looking at these things the whole time, including people like Bellingcat. So they and many other people who you've never heard of, who have vast amounts of time just to look at these videos all day and post things handily online. One of the key things that we found that was really helpful, and this applies for any type of social media searching that you're doing, is the first thing you would think about doing instinctively is just going on and typing in, I don't know, a Bulgaria mortar shell or Bulgaria machine gun or something like that. But obviously that doesn't appear in any of the Twitter feeds. For one thing, most of the YouTube and Facebook profiles are in Arabic, so that's not really going to help writing it in English. So you need to think about how the person is likely, the person that's posting it is likely described it. And one neat way that we found to get around this was just using millimeter in Arabic and the different types of caliber, because there aren't that many tweets or YouTube postings about 82 millimeter with 82 millimeters in, which aren't about mortars. And 82 millimeter shells are only made in Eastern Europe, so that was one way of quite getting in there really quickly. And the other thing that we realised was actually that the mortar shells were quite good because they're in big boxes. And although the cameras are a bit shaky, you could normally make out on these big boxes the serial numbers and lot numbers on there. So we decided to concentrate on those because it's obviously much easier to see serial numbers on one of these big mortar shells than on a small bullet. So that was one way we did it. And then through that we found Facebook profiles of actual, rather than groups, actual fighters on the ground, and we traced one weapon from the factory in Serbia via a broker in Bulgaria to a training camp in Saudi Arabia, then on to Turkey and into Syria, and spoke to the actual fighter on the ground. And we started off with him because he was posing. He was obviously quite pleased. He'd got a new Serbian heavy machine gun called a Coyote, and he posted some pictures up on his Facebook profile. He had put his new shoes on, and he was looking really tough. He's only, he's an 18-year-old guy. And yeah, we sent lots of messages, lots of people, and most of them obviously ignored us, probably quite rightly. But he was like, yeah, I'm sure we'll speak to you. And then, he would, and we would Facebook him from Syria, and he took us to where the heavy machine gun was in use and filmed it on the ground and gave us the serial number, which we were then able to trace back and work out the full route. So that was, so you started off with just a social media posting, and from there you were able to trace it really into the heart of the story. Flight data, yeah. So this was what almost cost me my marriage. I've managed to wean myself off now. I'm just concentrating on ship tracking these days. We took inspiration. We decided to concentrate on flights as one way into the story, partly piggybacking on the work that the guys who had done the investigations into Extraordinary Rendition, because they'd done an amazing job in exposing these secret CIA camps and torture by deploying by harnessing the power of plane spotters. These are the thousands, tens of thousands of geeks all across the world who like to go and look at interesting planes, and they like to put their results on the internet. And they have open groups, they have websites. They're passionate about what they do. They like to talk to you about, the latest bird that they've seen that fly in, and they're incredibly knowledgeable because they spend so much time looking at flights. They notice something unusual. That's partly how the rendition was exposed. Plane spotters were saying there was something weird happening here. And likewise, we started getting in touch with the plane spotters, and they said, yeah, it is strange. We'd never seen any flights to Saudi Arabia, and then suddenly in 2013 there are loads of them, and there have been all these weird Belarusian cargo planes coming in. And oh, by the way, here's this picture, and you saw the picture. That was plane spotter who basically said, yeah, just seen this plane, according to one of our sources at the airport, it's got ammunition on board. And so that was a great starting point for sort of getting going with the story. Like I said, it's difficult to hide a plane on a tarmac, and it's very easy to track them these days with commercial flight tracking software, which is available to anyone and relatively cheap, even if you want the more advanced ways of advanced options. So we'll spend a lot of time working out which flights to and which planes to track. And it was basically the idea was how to narrow it down to a reasonable field of dodgy cargo carriers and planes, so that you can actually, you're not monitoring thousands of flights, you're monitoring only maybe 10 companies and 40, 50 different planes. So one of the things that we did was we looked at UN Sanctions Committee reports. So the UN, for any UN sanctions, say there are UN sanctions on Libya, on Yemen, on Somalia, they're previously on Liberia, Iran, Korea. There are committees. They're called panels of experts, including arms experts, shipping experts, and all sorts of different people who spend their time investigating whether or not the sanctions are being breached. And one of the big things is obviously weapons. And so they're an incredible resource if you're trying to look at arms smuggling or any type of smuggling or any type of sort of wrongdoing, really, because they produce 6-month or yearly reports, and they produce and they publish their source material. So this was something that was published in the Libyan Sanctions Panel report in 2015, and it's a flight manifest from Libya of a Belarusian plane called Ruby Star landing in Libya and delivering weapons. And you can see on there some tail numbers. Sorry, EW is a tail number, and RSB is the call sign, so it's the flight call sign that it sends out on a particular flight. So we knew that this plane was coming from Serbia, and we knew that it was carrying weapons, and so we thought, well, okay, these guys are obviously a bit dodgy, so they'll go on the list, and then from there, you then start looking what other planes has this Ruby Star cargo carrier got? Where else have they been flying? And one of the things that we worked out quite quickly was that there was a specific type of plane which was most often used. It's an Aleutian 76, yeah, which is an old, it's sort of an old Russian huge plane, which is capable of carrying, I think it's about 100 tons at a time. It's able to land anywhere. It was obviously very common in the former Soviet Union. Lots of Ukrainian Russian pilots, and there are loads of them left over. They're aging, not always in great shape, but they're ideal for carrying weapons. And actually, most of the weapons in the world are certainly from Central and Eastern European countries are carried on this particular type of plane. And on a flight tracking website like this is Flight Radar 24, you can filter out all of the results to just look at IL-76's Aleutian. So you can just follow that type of plane. And so we started looking at where these planes were flying, and you could see that lots of them were flying between Iran and Syria, for example, which would have been another story, looking at Iranian exports to Syria. There were lots of planes flying from Russia to Syria, so that could have been another story. But the ones that we were interested in was Central and Eastern Europe. And once you've created, and then so we were able to filter out and come up with a list of credible suspects in terms of the type of plane, the dodgy carriers. And then we followed them. We then narrowed it down to flights between airports in Central and Eastern Europe and military bases in the Middle East. And I think we ended up with about 50 in the end, or more than maybe 70, wasn't it? Yeah, 70. We had 70 flights over a bit over a year.
Well, you had hundreds in the database, really.
Yeah.
But we ended up using 76 for the story because we confirmed most of those planes. And what was really helpful and useful is that also airports were publishing a list of flights of the cargo planes. So we would know, for example, days in advance that there will be this particular plane at this airport. And we didn't really know what's going to be there, where the plane was going, but at least we knew it was coming. And that actually proved very useful in the next part of the story, which was actually filming it.
Yeah. Well, we were lucky in that Belgrade was the only airport in that we found that was actually had a timetable for all its cargo flights. There was a plane spotter site for Czech Republic and Slovakia, which was publishing flights in advance. But actually elsewhere it's really difficult. But the other main investigative reporter on this was based in Belgrade. So we were lucky in that sense. I mean, in that it was pretty accessible, you know, and the airport in Belgrade was relatively easy to film. So we spent a fair bit of time just hanging around the airport, filming, taking pictures. We had a couple of sources at the airport who were helping us out, saying, yeah, they're loading, or we had lots of trial and error in terms of the best place to film. What we were trying to do here, so we had a list of around 70 flights, which we'd narrowed down to in terms of they were very likely to have been transporting weapons from Central and Eastern Europe to the Middle East. And there were a set of criteria that we were looking at in terms of, you know, does the cargo carrier have a track record of sending weapons? Is it going to a military base? Is it using, say, a military call sign? That sort of thing. But we wanted to go beyond that. We wanted to say with some degree of certainty there's definitely weapons on board. So one of the ways that we did that was trying to photograph them being loaded. And you can see in these pictures, not massively clearly, but you can see these are the boxes which are typically used. They're a typical type of box for any type of ammunition or military equipment. You can see on here you've got little orange chevrons, which means that there are explosives in there. So that's another sign. Another sign is you've got a police escort that you would only get for explosives. So that helped us. So we're narrowing down the field. We've got 4 or 5 here, which have definitely got ammunition on board. But again, we wanted to take it a little bit further than that. So we put in a whole range of freedom of information requests to try and get the permits, because if a plane is taking off or landing or doing an overflight with ammunition or weapons, it needs a special permit. And so we put in a freedom of information request in Serbia for that, and they initially said no, and then we took them to appeal, and they said, and then they said, what is it that you actually want? And we said, well, what we really want is the is just confirmation that there's a permit for arms and ammunition. And they said, okay, well, if you we'll happily tell you that, but you know, we're not going to be able to give you all of the documents and withdraw the complaint, and we'll send you all the data. And we said, okay, fine, that's exactly what we need. And so they sent us a list of 50 planes, which was confirmed pretty much all of the ones that we had on the list were definitely carrying weapons. So the last step was actually just a simple freedom of information request. And then by that point, we were sort of thinking, well, maybe we could have done that right at the beginning and not bothered, you know, running after planes halfway through. But they wouldn't have given us those flights initially. It was kind of we ended up having to sort of negotiate it. And this was the confirmed ones. This was sort of the visualization of the confirmed flights in all its glory.
So one of the important segments was also developing sources, and not only sources in the government, but also sources in manufacturers, and also arms dealers, and basically the people who were buying weapons as well. And in a way, we were very lucky that we actually had sources in all of these segments. So we actually talked with the arms dealers. And for me, actually, one of the arms dealers, I completely met him by chance. I was literally in a restaurant in Istanbul, and I was sitting with somebody. He was sitting next, you know, at the next table, and he was a Jordanian arms buyer, and he was basically shipping weapons to Syria. And it was kind of fascinating. I was sitting with somebody from US he used to be a military person, and he didn't register I was a journalist, so he was actually talking about shipments, which was really, really fascinating. And then we also had a source from inside the Libyan government who was actually purchasing weapons. And that was also a fascinating thing and a very strange experience. When I first flew to Istanbul to meet a person, you know, he was Islamist. He wouldn't even look at me. Like literally, I wanted to shake hands, and he turned his head like this. It was like, oh, this is going to be difficult. And then for the first half an hour of our conversation, he wouldn't even look at me, like at all. He was speaking to the left. And then suddenly I asked him a question, and this was really good in terms of opening him up and like getting him to speak, because I asked him a question of the things that he thought I didn't know. And I was very direct, and he was surprised. How do I know about this particular contract and the arms deal? And then suddenly he actually started talking and giving us a background of, you know, government officials and how the deal happened and so on. So this was very useful. So in a way, you know, we relied a lot on developing sources, and also we had sources who have given us certificates for the exports, and we could see like the shopping list of things that they were buying. We had sources who would tell us that, oh, they're currently in the Czech Republic negotiating this particular deal, which was also, it was kind of like a goose chase. You know, we know they're meeting these people and they're going to meet here, and you know, is there a way that, you know, for us to take a picture or learn more of what's going on and when shipments is going to happen?
I was just going to say, yeah, one of the most important sources we got came for the second story about the US shipments, came as we were about to publish that story, and we've been trying to get the source to speak for months and months prior to it. But what went into that was, I mean, to get to the stage where we got in touch and were able to convince him was there was a whole strategy behind it, in terms of we had pinpointed this particular person as being the most likely to talk out of any of the guys in the field, and had worked out the best way to approach them, how it was that we were going to present ourselves in terms of we were providing him with an incentive to talk to us. So when you're thinking about approaching a source, I really recommend, especially in something critical like this, where you're not necessarily going to get many goes at it, and there aren't necessarily that many people who are going to be willing to talk to you. You've got to have a proper strategy and think carefully. And you're only really going to get there often unless you really strike lucky and you end up having someone next to you in a restaurant. You're only going to get there once you know the background and you can impress them, and then they start opening up.
Yeah. The reason why the buyer from Libya basically opened up was he was suddenly, oh, they know more. And I think part of it was he was trying to figure out how far we know and how much we know. And he was basically, because I was playing like, yes, I know a lot. So he was willing to share more than otherwise he would. This was a very interesting document. One of the things we relied on were also leak. And a leak that kind of wasn't public. It was a Moldova leak. Yeah, but that came from Moldova data, right?
Bulgaria.
Oh, okay. Well, obviously we had several leaks where we got information, and this was actually very useful because it was end user certificates. There was an airline who was leaked at one point, and then the Azeri embassy in Bulgaria was leaked, and all these documents were released. And I think we were lucky that we were paying attention and doing all kinds of searches, and we just came across a leak which contained a lot of useful documents that were surprised.
Yeah, and then it's a question of kind of mining the documents to get the most important bits. And what was really great, what was useful here is that what was in these documents dovetailed with what the source was telling us. So we just met the source, and he'd given us, we'd seen one of these, but he wouldn't let us have an actual copy. And what the end user said was identical to here, and then the material was leaked. So it kind of it meant that we had confidence the leak was genuine for starters, because there's a lot of stuff that there are attempts now to leak things out which are just what's the word, kind of fraudulently put together.
So what made this collaboration? I think we can honestly say that both of us had PTSD from each other at the end of it, like when it was published. I literally would be in the evening, I would be sitting home, I'm thinking, I should be talking to Lawrence now. It was like separation issues and all kinds of things. And part of it really because we were breathing and living this story for a year and constantly talking, especially when we were writing and editing story and going back and forth and trying to, understand how to put it. Because if you can, from what he told you, there was so much information we gathered. And I think we became such an experts in the industry that it was so difficult to actually tell a story that would be comprehensible and easy to read. Because yes, the flights are fascinating, but nobody wants to read so much about how many nights you spend tracking flights or details of each particular flights. Exactly. So for us, the trust was really important. And I think that really made it easy for us to really work together nonstop for a year, but also to publish the same story instead of each of us running in their own direction and publishing their own story. And part of it is, of course, we knew each other from before. So we've already developed the friendship. But then also early on in one of our first meetings, we basically said, we're going to share everything. No matter, if you think it's stupid or not useful to another party, we're just going to share. And we would have these meetings where we would just discuss the different leads, who was doing what, which direction we should go. And we were very open. We didn't try to scoop each other or, I'm going to keep this piece of information for myself. It was very, very open. And we had a sharing platform, so every piece of document, every statistic, it was shared and everybody was able to see it. And that was also useful because sometimes if you're a reporter in a story or you're covering a particular angle, you might miss something or not pay attention to something. So if you have somebody from the outside who reads the document or hears you talk about your research, suddenly they have questions and things that you might not notice. Do you want to say something?
No, we were just thinking. We used mostly encrypted, didn't we?
Yes.
So Stackfield, I think, was what we were sharing on, but it's not. I don't know if.
It was encrypted. It has encrypted
and then Signal
channels
as well, obviously at the. Yeah, because I mean, halfway through we were concerned that, well, we basically had tip-off that somebody was going to likely try and disrupt the investigation, so we had to then take extra precautions. But yeah, it all turned out fine in the end.
Yeah, and you know, it was about respect, and I think we all respected each other's work, even though in a way we were also from competing organizations. So it resulted in a great partnership. But there were also challenges, and one of the challenges was to keep the focus, you know, because there were so many angles of the story, so many leads, so many deals to investigate, and at some point it felt like we were chasing 1,000 leads, and you know, what is our story? What are we going to publish, and when are we going to publish? And then it was also about having clear tasks or having a separation of work, so people don't go and repeat the same steps and same assignments. Also about being flexible, because you know, I think we started with one idea of the story in the package, and I think we changed it a couple of times before, you know, we ended up with this package. And I think even at the very end, when we already had a draft, we were changing what the story really is and how we're going to tell the story. So that was important. And then communicating, really. And I think we probably overdid it. There were many nights where we were talking until 3 a.m. and getting no sleep on the story, but that really made a difference.
I think one of the reasons it worked actually is that we did have a completely different hypothesis when we started off. We started off, we were going to try and prove some sort of corruption and involvement of some kind of high-profile figures, and we had a tip-off about which suggested that this was potentially the story, and that didn't just work out, but we could enter into the whole investigative research process knowing that the fallback option was still a good story. So we knew that we had the statistics and the open data stuff that we could rely on, and that we would be able to tell some sort of a story, whatever happened. And it turned out that actually the statistics and the open data led us into a much more in-depth story. But our initial theory proved, well, certainly we weren't able to prove it. So and so it was important we had something to fall back on. Otherwise, we would have wasted months of work.
I think this turned to be a better story than the initial one we actually wanted to do. A big challenge when it comes to projects like this is how to tell these stories. And I remember, you know, we on the second story, one of our fact checkers, she read the story and she says, "I don't get this." And we were like, "Oh, we better go back to the drawing board and retell the story so, you know, everybody can understand it." And I'm happy we actually listened to people who were reading the story, because otherwise we would end up with a story that probably didn't read so well. And it really is true. Like, you know, as investigative journalists, in this case, we spent a year working, or 2 years, for the other story. And it would be a shame if we ended up with, you know, mind-numbing statistics, which we could easily have ended up with, you know, because I think I've never worked on a story which had more numbers. And it was really difficult to decide, okay, what do we, you know, take out of the story? What do we not include? Because, you know, it was hard work. We were curious and interested, and, you know, it was difficult to decide what readers would be interested in or not. So
we ended up using most of the material just later on. So then we basically put a lot to one side and came back to it later. So we've had, apart from the two main investigations, we probably had 8 or 9 stories on the topic, and we just allowed those other issues to develop into their own stories.
Yeah, we had many side stories that we didn't actually plan at the beginning, and also we used a lot of graphics, we used videos in order to simplify the story. And also, I think at the moment when the stories were getting really complicated in the narrative, we tried to, you know, brace yourself. There's a difficult part coming. You know, and you know, we were trying to limit quotes. One of the big problems was the jargons, because in the arms industry, you know, when you say mortar shells, and like, what is that? You know, you have no clue. So it was easy to make a story complicated because we were using terminology that wasn't clear, and we basically spent a lot of time trying to simplify and not necessarily use what the experts would use as a terminology, but actually what regular people can understand. And in the end, I think we did a lot of cutting, and I think that's another good advice. I think we started with a really, really long story, and we battled over every paragraph that had to be taken out, but I think in the end it made it much easier to read. So that's it.